And ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's time to start the session 1. The title is COVID-19 and Aviation Working Tours Aviation Restart. Questions for a session can be submitted through indicated the QR code on the screen and as well Q&A link on the YouTube. See more. We have prepared small prizes for several questioners, so please do give us your attention. And I would like to introduce our moderator, the Chair Stanislao Asono Angesomo, Recovery Task Force of Icao, permanent representative of Equatorial Guinea on the Council of Icao. So he's waiting for us, so let's meet him on the screen. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you so much.
Excellencies, Minister of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, Republic of Korea, Madam Yimi Kim. His Excellency, Minister of Culture, Sport and Tourism of Republic of Korea, Mr. Yang Yu Park. Madam Secretary General of Icao, Dr. Fan Liu. Distinguished guests and delegates, dear friends and colleagues, all protocol observed. It is a great honor for me as a chairperson of Icao Council Aviation Recovery Task Force to moderate the first session of Aviation Tourism Recovery Forum, which officially has been opened today by the Honorable Minister of Land, Infrastructure and Transport. From this end, I would like to be very brief, but before going with the peoples and colleagues that we are going to share with you, the experience that we have witnessed the last 8 months of CAT, I would like to summarize the following. CAT Part 1 was established following the Council declaration on the novel coronavirus COVID-19 adopted on 9 March 2020. The Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, composed of representatives from Icao Council members, states, international organizations, industry, UN specialized agencies, and supported by the Secretariat, was tasked to identify and recommend strategic priorities and policy support state and industry focused on the following main pillars. To address the immediate challenge faced by the aviation industry and states, to facilitate the restart of aviation operations in sustainable, safe, secure, and orderly manner as soon as practicable, to address long-term impact, including economic and financial impact, and to build a more resilient aviation system in the long term. With the 4 principles, also the task force card, I was able to establish 10 principles, which basically goes around 1, protect people, harmonizing measures, while remaining flexible, work as one aviation team, ensure solidarity, ensure essential connectivity, actively manage safety and secure health related to risk measures, make aviation public health measure work with our safety and security system, strengthen public confidence, support financial relief strategies to help the aviation industry, ensure sustainability, and learn from lessons to improve resilience. From these 2 parts of CAT 1 and CAT 2, the following issues has been very well targeted, and as you will hear the main speakers today, starting from one side, quarantine, testing, risk assess management, public health corridor issues, passengers, public transport, and public aviation measures, business aviation, general aviation, including and not least mental health issues. With this in view, the last 8 months, 7 months has been basically, from one side, putting what could assist the international community and has been a clear learning lesson between collaborating industry and collaborating with the organ of Icao called Council in order to ensure that the restart and recovery is taking in place as soon as possible. But having said so, during that period also, we have received, after sending the guidelines to member states, the feedback received has also been our concern. From one side, harmonizing, testing, borders, and so forth. And from the other side, trying to alleviate the burden of the passenger in order to fly with confidence and secure. With this short introduction, this evening you are going to listen the following speakers. From one side, the first speaker will be Mohamed Khalifa Rama. The second speaker will be Dr. Jordan. Dr. Jordan is the Chief Medical Doctor for Icao. The third speaker will be Crawford, the Vice President of IATA for Asian region, and Miss Fox, who is a senior officer of Icao and a former senior officer from the United Nations. With this short introduction, I would like to first of all to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Mohamed Khalifa Rama. Mr. Mohamed Khalifa Rama, Director of Air Transport and Secretary of CAT, joined the Transport Bureau on 5th May 2020. Before that, Mr. Mohamed Khalifa Rama, he was the Regional Director for Icao Middle East Regional Office based in Cairo. Before that, prior to join Icao, Mr. Rama was the Under-Secretary General on the International and Internal Affairs at the Ministry of Civil Aviation of Egypt, and previously the advisor to the Egyptian Minister of Civil Aviation. Mr. Rama also served as Secretary of Icao Council Aviation Recovery Task Force. Mr. Rama has more than 30 years experience on civil aviation, both starting with management, airline training, operation safety, and so forth. Mr. Mohamed Khalifa Rama, he holds an MBA in aviation management and is fluent in English and Arabic. With further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Mohamed Khalifa Rama, Secretary of CAT and Director of Air Transport Bureau of Icao. Mr. Rama, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Isono, for this nice introduction. And until the slides are shown on the screen, I can see the slides starting, so I will start so as not to lose time. First of all, good day to all, and it's a great pleasure to participate in this Aviation Tourism Recovery Forum. And I wish to thank the organizers, the host, the ministries in Korea for giving me the opportunity to present to you the latest updates on Icao guidance, aiming to support the expeditious recovery of the aviation industry. Next slide, please. As the chairman of the CART, Ambassador Isono, has highlighted, since the onset of the COVID-19 outbreak, Icao has been providing support and guidance to states and to the industry. And I remember back in April when the work of the CART has begun, there was a lot of tensions around, and we need to Icao needs to take leadership by its council in order to make sure that we need to provide practical, aligned guidance to restart the air transport sector and to recover it from the impact of COVID-19 on a global basis. As the chair has said, the CART phase 1 was concluded on the 1st of June with the adoption of the CART report, including 10 key principles and 11 recommendations, as well as the associated document titled Takeoff Guidance for Air Travel Through the COVID-19 Public Health Crisis. While these two documents proved very helpful for states, they were widely received and by operators as well. But the continuously deteriorating situation of the pandemic made it clear that a new phase of CART would be necessary. Hence, phase 2 of the CART was launched in mid-August to review the first edition of the Takeoff Guidance, as well as the relevant public health measures and the other public health measures that is listed in the Takeoff Guidance. Next slide, please. So the CART phase 2 generated 3 main outcomes, as you can see on the screen, which were adopted by the Icao Council last month on the 9th of November. These 3 products or deliverables reflected the evolving technological and medical advancements in the fight against the COVID-19, as well as the feedback received from member states, from international organizations, including WHO, and also regional organizations, and from our industry partners. Next slide, please. First, I would like to talk a bit about the recommendations made by CART to the global community. Next slide. The CART report released in June outlined 10 key principles. I will not go into details, but you can see it on the screen, which shall guide all the efforts for the recovery of civil aviation. And the 11 recommendations are divided into 4 thematic areas or categories. We see on the slide that the first 3 recommendations are related to aviation safety related measures. Next slide, please. The 4th and the 5th recommendations relate to the aviation public health measures, while security and facilitation related measures are recommendations 6, 7, 8, and 9. Continuing to the next slide, please. The economic and the financial measures have 1 encompassing recommendation, which is recommendation 10, and the final category pertains to the regular monitoring and sharing of experiences through Icao, which is recommendation 11. Next slide, please. You can move to the next slide, please. And next slide again. Thank you. In the high-level cover document of CART Phase 2 introduces 3 new recommendations, which complement the 11 recommendations in the initial CART report published in June, and even the recommendation are numbered after these 11, so the new recommendations are 12, 13, and 14. For recommendation 12 on aviation safety-related measures, this recommendation advises states to take measures to mitigate risk associated with the prolonged regulatory elevation and to encourage states to facilitate access to medical and training facilities. And this recommendation was really very important in order to make sure that this elevation will not continue after the 31st of March next year. And then recommendation 13, which focuses on testing and cross-border risk management measures and advises states to apply their COVID-19 risk management measures, an approach outlined in the recently published Testing and Cross-Border Risk Management Measures Manual that was produced also on the phase 2 of the CART. And then recommendation 14 on public health corridor which encourages states to actively share information with each other to implement the public health corridor in a harmonized manner. I would like to provide a quick refresher overview of the takeoff guidance, which published for the second time in November, whose first edition issued in June and has been thoroughly reviewed in the second phase of CART. And you can see in this slide that the takeoff guidance consists of guidance on risk mitigation measures that apply to all phases of air passenger and cargo transport. It contains also measures applicable to 4 specific modules, like airports, aircraft, crew, and cargo, as well as public health corridor forms and posters. Next slide, please. So, generally, applicable risk mitigation measures related to the 11 elements depicted in this slide. These measures should be implemented in adherence to the applicable laws, regulations, requirements, and standards and guidance issued by either subnational, national, or international authorities. Next slide, please. So the scope of each of the 4 modules is outlined in this slide. Airport module, of course, is targeted to airport operators, authorities, governments, while aircraft module is for operator covered under Annex 6, operation of aircraft, while crew module is targeted to all operation covered under Annex 6, civil aviation authorities and public health agencies. Target audience of cargo modules, of course, include airline, freight forwarders, truckers, and ground handler. Next slide, please. I would like to inform you of which element and areas were new or updated in the second edition of the takeoff guidance. And of course, we updated the existing modules, but not only this, there are new and updated guidance that was included concerning the public health risk mitigation measures based on the latest scientific evidence and crisis developments. Also, new reference are made to non-commercial aviation. Next slide, please. As indicated in this slide, you can see that the focus of the updates was on commercial air transport passenger journey. For example, update of the airport module includes the use of personal protective equipment, assurance of passengers' flows and approaches to security screening. Next slide, please. General applicable measures include new text on general hygiene, face covering, and medical masks, passengers with reduced mobility, and promoting and maintaining and supporting the mental well-being for both passengers and crews. Next slide, please. CART always strives to support all players of the industry. For this reason, the takeoff guidance also introduces references to risk mitigation measures applicable to aviation sectors other than the commercial air transport, such as air traffic control, general aviation, and business aviation. The CART recommendations and the takeoff guidelines are designed to allow member states and industry to implement harmonized risk mitigation measures in full accordance with the latest medical and traveler health advice available. I wish that all of you to access to the dedicated Icao website on the COVID-19 response and recovery platform, which provides the necessary information that you need in this regard. Next slide, please. While the international and regional needs may require different approaches, the importance of a globally and regionally harmonized and mutually accepted measures provided by CART cannot be overemphasized. States and industry are urged to follow and implement the CART recommendations and the takeoff guidance according to their specific needs, of course, and circumstances. Let me now show you to which extent the CART recommendation and guidance have been implemented by the states globally. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is one of the dashboards that we have on the GRIC, which is the monitoring tool for the implementation of the CART recommendations. And you can see that approximately 98% of the states have nominated their focal points for the CRIC, and 82% of the states have completed their gap analysis related to the 11 initial CART recommendations. And approximately 46% have completed reporting on the adoption of the public health measures contained in the Takeoff guidance. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see one also of the dashboards of the CRIC, providing the global level of implementation of each CART recommendation by 3 key stages, either fully implemented or in progress or not started. Of course, additional dashboards are available in the CRIC with regional and national data on the implementation of the CART recommendation and the adoption of CART public health related measures. The current data indicates that the highest implementation is for the recommendation number 7, and the lowest implementation is for recommendation number 10, except of course for the 3 new recommendations, which you can see at the right of the screen, which is still very low in the implementation because they had just been distributed to states. Next slide, please. What should be next? My quick answer is we need to continue the recovery and to make the civil aviation more resilient and sustainable. Next slide, please. Of course, the collective and the coordinated and devoted efforts of the states and the industry continue to be required to mitigate the risks. We are still under the crisis of the pandemic and we need to work collectively in order to get through this difficult time. And this is a prerequisite and the only sustainable solution to overcome the economic and the financial situation that the industry is facing. Beyond the current recovery efforts, states and industry also need to learn from the lessons of this crisis and to prepare and to have a proper response to build back better for the future. Icao is committed to the global coordination and collaboration with all aviation stakeholders in order to support the sector. And Icao Council has already decided that the CART will continue under the leadership of the chair of the CART, Ambassador Isono, and to update the guidance when appropriate and monitor and assess the situation and coordinate the actions among all stakeholders. I think this is my last slide, Mr. Chair. So I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I hope you find this information helpful. And of course, my colleague panelists will shed more light on these activities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Well done. Before we continue, I would like to invite everybody that we should finish first the 4 or 5 presentation, and after we will open section for question. With these few remarks, I would like to invite Dr. Ansa Jordan. Dr. Ansa Jordan, Dr. Ansa Jordan, he will work with us, will walk through all aviation health safety related issue with main focus on mental health. But before introducing Dr. Ansa Jordan, I would like to remind all of us that in terms of question and answer, that will be taken at the end of the last speaker. Dr. Ansa Jordan joined the International Civil Aviation Organization in October 2015 and is currently the Chief of Aviation Medicine Section, responsible for aviation medical standard and the CAPSA program preventing transmission of communicable disease by air. She graduated in 1989 as a medical doctor and has 2 postgraduate degrees, aerospace medicine and occupational health. In 1999, she established the Aviation Medicine Department in the South Africa Civil Aviation Industry Authority. After having worked in South Africa Military Institute of Aviation Medicine, in 2003, she left Civil Aviation Authority and worked as independent consultant in the aviation industry until 2007. She then joined South Africa Airways, where she worked as a medical director until 2011. In 2012, she returned to aviation and was the medical director of occupational health and international source. She is a member of Aerospace Medicine Association, the International Academy of Aviation and Space Medicine, the Airline Medical Directors Association, and provide consultation service to the World Health Organization. With this few remarks, I would like to invite Dr. Jordan to open the floor and to share with us her experience during this period of COVID-19. Over to you, Dr. Jordan.
Thank you, Ambassador Sono. And good morning. No, I think, where are we? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think in Korea. And good evening to us here in Montreal.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank the presenters for inviting me to talk about this very important issue about mental health. Because we all talk about COVID-19 and the big pandemic, but we don't talk about the silent pandemic, which is mental health that goes hand in hand with it. So can I have the next slide, please? So talking about health, WHO defines health as a complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not a disease, not an absence of disease. And if you look at the definition of mental health, which talks about abilities of an individual coping with normal stresses of life, working productively, and making contribution to the community, I think we can all agree that in terms of mental health, we all have been affected by COVID-19. And that is really a problem that we're dealing with, which we do not always realize. Next slide, please. So talking about, sorry, I cannot really see the slides as well. Talking about aviation and mental health. What are the challenges specifically in aviation? We all have to deal with the normal threats of COVID-19, which is disease, afraid of losing people. But then if we want to travel, there's additional issues. We have additional processes. We have all these public health measures that are being implemented. We also have border control measures that we have to deal with. So in terms of that, it creates problems. But for air crew, it is even a worse situation because they have loss of income. Some of them do not have any jobs. They have been furloughed. Those that do fly have to deal with unruly passengers. Crew do not have access to medical examiners, medical service providers. They also do not have access to their training, simulator training, which is really causing a problem for us in terms of aviation safety in the future, not necessarily now. And then should crew become infected with COVID-19, they need to know how do they get back to flying. Will they be made fit to fly? We hear all these chronic effects that COVID-19 has on the body. We're talking about brain fog. We're talking about months for people to recover from COVID-19. So for someone whose life and livelihood is dependent on his medical fitness, this is a real big stress for pilots and cabin crew. Next slide, please. We briefly talked about, well, my colleague discussed CARD takeoff guidance. What we have is we included in the CARD takeoff guidance, we addressed the option or the issue of maintaining mental health and well-being. And CARD recognized that the impact of COVID-19 on mental health can have an impact on aviation safety. And like anything else that we have learned from CAPSCA and that we have learned from CARD, where all of us need to work together, this is the same when we deal with mental health. We need multi-sector collaboration to not only address the effects on our aviation personnel, but also on passengers, because they are as badly affected as our aviation crew. Next slide, please. So how do we mitigate the effect of COVID-19? Collaboration, we already said that. The thing is, we need to recognize what the effects are on our psychological well-being and how do we balance personal and public safety. I'm sure you will be reminded of the Germanwings accident, where mental health really became a big talking point within aviation. So we have really a silent epidemic here. We have the pandemic, which is all good and well, but we now have crew who is not sure about employment. They have other anxiety factors. They do not have access to their training facilities like they should. They're losing self-confidence. So we really need to address the mental health issue. It is important. What Icao has done in that aspect is we issued an electronic bulletin to remind or focus on different principles dealing with mental health for all stakeholders, and then also focusing on peer support, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then we are also developing various guidance material, which we'll get to later as well. Next slide. So key principles. If we talk about aviation stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, and you can see there on the right hand of the diagram, the outer circle is all our stakeholders that is really involved in mental health management. The middle part is who is all affected in aviation with respect to personnel. And what we need to do from a comprehensive global perspective for all stakeholders is, apart from collaboration, which we have mentioned a number of times now, is we need to realize that there are cultural differences in recognizing issues of mental health, dealing with mental health issues, and we need to make sure that we have a comprehensive and a common understanding of addressing these behaviors. And the other important thing is to realize that it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. If you're anxious because of COVID-19, you don't have a mental disease. You're just reacting in a normal way. And we need to provide a safe environment to people to ensure them that we can support them. Next slide, please. So with national aviation authorities, the key part would be for crew, is the last point on this slide, is keep stakeholders involved, keep everybody informed. How do you maintain your medical license? How do you maintain your normal aviation license so that you can do your duties safely? The problem we have at the moment is crew cannot get to their medical examinations, they cannot do their training. Some of them want to continue doing their medical examination because they want to remain employable. Because at the moment, a lot of pilots has been furloughed, they've been laid off, and they are afraid that they will not be employed in future. So these are issues that we really need to address. Next slide. Industry service providers all plays a role, not only for our aviation personnel, but also for the passengers. So peer support programs is essential in this environment to provide guidance to people that is under the same circumstances as us. And I'm talking there referring to pilots and cabin crew. If an aviation organization or an airline do not have a peer support program, they need to make available a peer support program or details of a peer support program where they can get access to support. It also should be extended to all personnel. We tend to focus on pilots in the industry, but the aviation industry consists of way more different personnel types, which is all important in terms of safety. So we need to look at all of those categories. And then we need to create that environment that if there is a problem or if there is a concern, that our safety management system keeps up with that pilots or crew is not afraid to report something that they're scared of or that they're concerned about for fear of losing their job. And unfortunately, this is what is happening in reality. And we really need to see that we support someone who raises concern. And then the passengers, there's so many changes that passengers have to be aware of, and things change constantly. So normally passengers would experience flights as stressful, and now it's even 10 times worse, 100 times worse, having to do more planning, not knowing if you're going to be quarantined when you get on the other side, not knowing if you're on the other side, whether you'll be able to return home due to changes in the pandemic. So airlines also should provide information to passengers and help them. Next slide. If we're looking at the continuity of mental health, if you look at the slide on the right-hand side, on the horizontal axis, you can see you begin from a well and healthy person, and then you can get more stress, you can get more problems, and you can progress to mental ill health, where you can get depression, where you can start using substances to help you cope. So what we are trying to do with the aviation medical examiners is they know how to provide support. They become involved in active discussions, but the important part in this case is for them to refer to the appropriate support system. And in 90% of the time, that will be the peer support system and not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because these normal reactions, remember, to an abnormal situation, these people are not pathologically ill with depression. They are coping with a problem. And this is where we need to give them that support. Next slide, please. More important is every one of us need to take responsibility for ourselves and our own health. All crew, all managers, they need to be aware of what's happening. And we need to look, this picture comes from the Fitness to Fly publication that Icao has published. This is the part on mental health. So all of us need to practice self-care. And that means get enough sleep, eat enough, exercise enough, try to get rid of your stresses, get a safety support system, and then seek assistance when you realize you have a problem. Don't see it as a weakness. See it as I'm getting support to make my performance better. People are so afraid to be stigmatized with mental health issues, and it really, really is not worth it. And then the other one is, if you see a colleague who has a problem, talk to him, help him, get him to get support. It's easier to take 2 weeks off to deal with an anxiety issue than having to lose the license because you were afraid to admit that you have stress that you need assistance with to cope with. Okay, next slide. Talking about peer support, and that for me is really important. So what is a peer? And I'm going to read that because this is a very good definition. So peers are well-trained, skilled colleagues. They are trustworthy. They have common qualifications and experiences. They may have encountered similar situations. They work within the same or similar operational context and can relate to their colleague's situation. And that is so true. We have had so much success with peer support programs. And as you can see there on the left, they are topics, they don't just address 1 or 2 topics. They really has a whole array of topics that they're addressing. Critical incident response, we're talking there about mitigating the effects of trauma. What we are undergoing now with COVID-19 is really a traumatic situation. So pilots should reach out to peer support programs to help them. We're looking at training issues, substance addiction, maintaining professional standards. How do you liaise with your AME if you have COVID-19 and say, oh, I actually don't want to tell my medical examiner that I've had COVID-19 because I don't know if I'll be returned back to flying. That's peer that cares about you will say, oh, but you need to do that because it will help you. It will get you back on your feet much quicker. It will be for your own safety, and it will also be for public safety. So it's important to have these programs in place. In our electronic bulletin, we provide guidance on implementation of peer programs, the design thereof, or the levels of care that they can provide. So, and we're also dividing more guidance material at the moment regarding that. And then my last slide on the next steps for mental health. So we're all talking about vaccines, and it's wonderful, and we hope it comes. I don't see it really being available before middle of next year. But what we forget is if you have a vaccine and you want to fly, you might not be able to fly for a few days or a few weeks after that. You might have adverse reactions. So from an aviation medicine perspective, we will be doing protocols on when you can return to flying. And the same with the other medical conditions or the effects of COVID-19, neurological problems, the brain fog, neurocognitive. It affects all of our systems. We have lung problems, we have heart problems. So all of that we will be addressing with protocols returning people fit to fly. And that is my last slide. Thank you, Mr. Sono.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jordan. Excellent, very clear, and all go to the point. Our next speaker is Mr. Conrad Klomford, Regional Vice President, Asia Pacific International Air Transport Association, IATA. Mr. Cole Clifford is a Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific at the International Air Transport Association, IATA. His key priorities is on further developing IATA partnerships across the region, enabling IATA global standard and perspective to deliver maximum value to the safe, sustainable and profitable development of aviation. He joined IATA on 1st February 2014. Prior to joining IATA, Mr. Conrad has a career in aviation spanning more than 33 years. As a CEO in several domestic flights, regional and international, he has an immense knowledge of top brands career, having worked for Cathay Pacific, Virgin Airlines, and Emirates. Conrad has lived and worked in Asia, Africa, Europe, and has a broad and in-depth knowledge of strategy, business planning, pricing and revenue management, and airport operation. Conrad is graduate from Cambridge University. He has obtained an MBA from Durban University Business School. He has broad international working experience and is able to converse in Mandarin Chinese and some French, German, Korean, Thai. Mr. Conrad enjoys outdoor activities, and Mr. Conrad also plays golf as part of a hobby. With these few remarks, I would like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Conrad Clifford, to share with us his experience with industry during this COVID-19 period. Over to you, Mr. Conrad.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador and Chairman Sono. Very kind words, thank you. I guess firstly, on behalf of IATA, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport and to the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism for co-hosting this very important event in Seoul. And it's a real pleasure to be with you here today, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about IATA's part in the collaboration with Icao and other agencies on CART and CAPSCA. And I'm standing in for Mike Comber, who's our director at Icao, and he sends his very best regards and apologizes. He's got a prior commitment today. Next slide, please. I don't need to tell you that this year has been the worst year in aviation history for all airlines, including, of course, IATA's member airlines. And we estimate that in the second half of this year, airlines will burn through something like $77 billion of funds, mostly just sitting on the ground. In the Asia-Pacific region, which I'm responsible for, we've seen a 90% reduction in international traffic, and a more than 50% reduction in most domestic markets. For airlines without a domestic market or with a small domestic market, most of them are simply sitting on the ground, burning through cash day in and day out, cutting costs by laying off staff, selling assets like aircraft and buildings, returning aircraft to lessors to try to survive to the restart. And what we've been saying as IATA to governments around the world is that we really need the aviation industry as a whole to receive financial support, and it needs to come quickly. Airlines don't have the financial reserves to wait for a vaccine to be available sometime next year. So funds need to be made available, and really, most important of all, borders need to be reopened so that airlines can get back flying and generating incomes again. And the other thing to mention in that respect is that it's not really the time now for governments to be adding costs and charges to aviation, which we've seen in some countries, because all of these increases in costs actually damp down the demand. And we need to really stimulate and incentivize people to get back to a restart. So that's the broad situation that we see now for aviation. Our interaction with Icao is absolutely invaluable. And I think, as many of the people on this call know, we work together to create hundreds of standards together in any given year. It's a painstaking, meticulous, very successful process over many years. And of course, it's a slow, measured process. We are represented on something like 17 technical panels and 6 other panels within Icao. When this pandemic first hit, we started to address the issues in what we call the initial priority areas in a normal way. We had no idea that this pandemic would go on for so long, or indeed that we would be hit with successive second and third and fourth waves. But COVID turned out to be something very different, and equally it couldn't be handled with a typical Icao process. It had to move very quickly to get the industry restarted as soon as possible. So the council recognized this and set up the CART. It was highly focused with very specific goals and a deadline set effectively by the requirement to report back to the council. And it's been an amazing success story so far. CART produced the Takeoff guidelines in 2 months, the updated CART 2 in another 2 months, and CAPSCA produced the testing manual concurrently with CART 2. So this has been an amazing achievement, and it's something which IATA is immensely proud to have been invited by the council to be a part of. And we look forward to a CART 3 and another CAPSCA on testing, vaccination, certification, and implementation as soon as possible next year. Next slide, please. So on here, we've outlined some of our interactions with Icao, and more specifically, the CART process. And as I said, when this pandemic struck, our initiatives tended to be reactive to the problems as they presented themselves. So we partnered with Icao from the outset, given the tremendous leverage with the states, and they reacted very promptly to the issues. So that's been fantastic. The initial priority areas, initial issues, which were again acted upon by Icao. For example, putting in a process for filing differences, a website where differences could be filled and where states could accept extensions of other states. These were fantastic achievements, but there was a point at which it became clear that the depth and the nature of the problem of this repeated waves were requiring higher level action. And so the Icao Council then decided to establish the CART to help take stock of the situation and to propose specific actions. The composition, very carefully chosen, and happily it included the industry, state members, and of course, more specifically, public health authorities, recognizing that throughout this pandemic, it's really been the public health authorities that have been calling the shots at the state level. IATA was invited to lead the first working group of CART, which developed the Takeoff guidance document that others have referred to. CAPSCA has really produced excellent guidance for Icao over time. Historically, it tended to work at a pace that was much slower, and it didn't really suit in this situation for that same sort of pace to be applied. But having said that, its composition is very strong on health authorities with the WHO, regional organizations, state medical regulators represented. And it was understood very early on that any document produced by CAPSCA would facilitate acceptance on the part of health authorities. And when the need for the use of testing on reducing restrictions such as quarantines was raised, it was recognized that this was a big step and well beyond simple sanitation measures. So CAPSCA was very much seen as the appropriate body to deal with all of these issues. And to provide it with a sort of a faster pace, a special group was set up to focus on testing with tight deadlines to prepare guidelines on the subject, which were delivered. So, so these were the main groups in the process, and now we'll take a look at what was produced by CART and CAPSCA. Next slide, please. The CART report set out a number of principles to be followed and issued a series of recommendations to states ranging from areas of operational safety to sanitation and passenger confidence. It also produced the standalone guidance document, the Takeoff, which contained generic sanitation procedures, as well as specific modules detailing procedures for airports, aircraft, crew, and cargo. State letters went out. There was an IPAC and a tracking process for implementation, which was introduced in the form of the CRR-IC on the website. And in its phase 2, the CART updated its work on sanitation measures and included references to documents in other areas, such as air traffic services units and general aviation, as well as guidance on dealing with things like long-term parked aircraft and of course, mental health that ANSWER's just delivered so capably. The CART phase 2 report was approved by the Icao Council and is published under a state letter. As for CAPSCA, it had initially produced much needed guidance material on handling the many cargo, repatriation, the other special flights taking place in the initial phase. It had been very successful in that. More importantly, the special working group that had been established generated a manual containing guidance on the use of a multi-layer approach to reduce risk, including testing. And it's a neutral tool. It allows for risk assessment to reach a desired level of safety by adding various components, which range from only basic sanitation through to the use of testing pre-departure, through to pre and post quarantines, and evaluating for each circumstance the mitigation that's being looked for. Other items that were considered are the incidence of infection at origin and destination. One of the successes for both of these tracks in CART and CAPSCA was that the guidance was kept at a high level. From an airline perspective, we're looking for as much harmonization as possible between different states in their response to the pandemic. What we don't want to see is 190 solutions, different solutions to the same problem. So the keeping it at a high level actually enabled these groups to achieve that. At the same time, it's obvious that individual states have different requirements, and of course they have to retain their sovereign rights in this regard. And one of the big issues in this respect was the approach to quarantine requirements. So the guidance was kept at a high enough level and given sufficient flexibility that actually it met the requirements of both tracks, and that's a big achievement. So the unexpectedly speedy delivery and effective guidance, the actions of the Council providing focus, bringing together a broad group of stakeholders, working groups keeping guidance at a high level with a fair degree of flexibility. These were all very successful ingredients in ensuring speedy and effective delivery. Next slide, please. Of course, the challenge from here, my goodness, we desperately need to see states actually opening borders, and we see that being achieved through testing regimes that will do away with the requirement for quarantines, because I'm sure everybody on this call knows that it's really the quarantines that make travel demand down to almost zero. So in our resolution at the IATA annual general meeting a couple of weeks ago, IATA and our airline members are calling on government to support the industry in reopening borders, and we've picked up a few highlighted points. Firstly, vaccines. I think Ansa mentioned. We don't think they'll be widely available until the second half of 2021. And another issue is that the countries that haven't been able to pre-purchase, as a lot of the richer countries have, but for other countries who haven't been able to pre-purchase, they'll be further back in the queue in terms of getting access to vaccine. So what we surmise is that waiting for a vaccine is not a solution that's going to work. We have to have both the testing and the vaccine together. The other thing that we note is that the air travel environment is very safe, and the biosafety measures that were incorporated in the Takeoff guidance that have been applied appear to be highly effective. And this is evidenced by the low incidence of in-flight transmission. So far, we're only aware of something less than 50 cases on something like 1.2 billion passengers traveled. Of course, we're never quite sure how many people slip through the net, possibly asymptomatic, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, these are very, very small numbers, which means it's a very safe environment. The government-managed quarantine regimes as well, they are extremely expensive to run. And there's growing evidence that the alternative, which is to ask people to isolate at home, is not particularly effective. So we very strongly advocate for systematic testing, which can reduce importation risk to very low levels. And that's particularly the case if the passengers arriving in one country are coming from another country that has similar or lower levels of prevalence. So finally, we noticed that other activities have been started in societies around the world, schools, offices, and actually the cabin environment is safer. The air is cleaner than both of those. So there are lots of reasons for states to think very carefully and hopefully to open up their borders. We've got some practical measures in this slide that governments can adopt to help them to reopen borders safely. But I just wanted to highlight one particular measure, and that is adopting a standardized global approach to health credentials, which will be critical for mutual recognition of test results and vaccine certificates. A common system is absolutely vital to avoid a complex patchwork. You remember the 190 solutions to one problem that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So we need, and I was very pleased to hear earlier, we are going to have a Part 3 and a CAPSCA. initiatives that will deliver the globally harmonized approach to health certification. And IATA is very ready to assist in every and any way that we can to do that. There are sort of three key issues that we've identified at the moment. Firstly, the implementation of the manual on testing. Icao has produced an IPAC, which we contributed to as well. We've also, within that IPAC, there's a checklist and a hyperlink to the IATA implementation manual, which we've recently produced, which should help states to implement quickly and effectively. The second thing is the establishment of a standard attestation for testing and for vaccines. This would need to be developed by CAPSCA, I would say, as they certainly have the medical expertise. And finally, one thing that we wanted to highlight was that we need to have a testing and a vaccine attestation standard that works not just for people that have been vaccinated or situations where testing applies, but actually in a mixed environment, because we are going to see a situation where some people are vaccinated, some people are not. Some countries have access to vaccines, some do not. So we need to have a standard and a system in place that can cope with both, with that circumstance. We're working with a number of pilot countries to develop, using public health corridors or bubbles, to develop a travel app. We call it the IATA Travel Pass, or ITP, that will facilitate the reopening of borders with a testing and vaccination protocol in place. And my colleague Vineet Goyal from IATA will talk about this in more detail on session 3. But we're building on a capability that we already have through a service called Thematic, where we provide information on visa requirements to passengers, airlines, governments. So this is straightforward. We're also working with COVAX, and I'm sure many members of the audience will know what COVAX is. We're working on the logistical side to come up with a standard for the safe and secure delivery of vaccines through air cargo. We already have a global standard for pharmaceuticals, which we call CEIV Pharma. And this is a specially adapted version of that program. And as you know, there are different challenges depending on the particular vaccine. Pfizer, for example, requires to be stored and transported at -50°C, which is very challenging. We're coming up with protocols and standards to facilitate that. And finally, representing our member airlines, we're working with a number of states around the world on reopening borders, and we are very happy to engage with any government that wants to open borders safely and securely. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. A very good presentation, very clear, illustrative, up to the point. Just for the sake of the times, I understand we are running out of the times. We need to be a little bit brief for the next speaker. I'm going to call over the next speaker, Mr. Michael Fox, the Chief Aviation Medicine Section, CAPSA, International Civil Aviation. Mix Fox is a graduate of Purdue University in the United States, where he was also flying instructor for the university. He has an honorary doctorate from National Aviation University of Ukraine. He has experience as a flight crew member for a corporation, as well as in non-scheduled and scheduled airline operation. He also experienced as a senior level manager in airline industry. Mix joined the International Civil Aviation in 1991 and has served the organization in various capacities during his nearly 28 years of experience. He has served in Trenair, in operation safety and strategic planning, and so on. And also, MIX has served with peacekeeping at headquarters, being in charge of more than 100 aircraft for peacekeeping. Most recently, MIX joined the International Coordination Council of Aerospace Industry Association, Icao, as its senior director strategy. MIX is based in Montreal and is in one of the two representatives of ICAO to Icao. Over to you, Mix.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We'll be brief. I understand that we are running out of time. Sorry about that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's always the advantage of being the last person and being very consistent in our messaging. I'd like to thank the Republic of Korea for this outstanding organization. I understand that there are over 300 participants that are listening in right now and are probably anxious to ask questions. Next slide, please. Just briefly, the International Coordinating Council of Aerospace Industry Associations is a global voice for aircraft manufacturers throughout the world. We have several members in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, an association in Singapore that recently joined as an observer, and a new observer in Malaysia that recently joined. Next slide, please. So we have encountered with the pandemic the largest shock to commercial air travel since World War II. Next slide, please. From the aircraft manufacturer standpoint, the impact has been tremendous. So just in manufacturing the aircraft, we have had over 175,000 direct jobs lost. And as this is a forum which is addressing both transport and tourism, we can only imagine the impact to the tourism industry in all countries, including the Republic of Korea. Next slide, please. As the previous speakers mentioned, the initial work of the CART by Icao was primarily reactive. It focused a lot on the extension of licenses and certificates that could not be renewed due to the current circumstances. Next slide. So as mentioned by the previous speakers, once the CART task force was organized in the April-May timeframe, it started its work in earnest and quite rapidly. It had been supported throughout by CAPSCA. CAPSCA, I think, is unique for many sectors as it combines both the aviation professionals coming from Icao, coming from states, and coming from the industry, along with the public health officials that are so necessary to address the measures that needed to be taken to protect the traveling public, but also to recover, restart and recover aviation. Next slide, please. So my colleagues have already described the phase one outcomes. The first phase of the CART wrapped up in the June timeframe, and it primarily focused in on the initial measures that needed to be taken to mitigate the risk of the transmission of COVID-19 during air travel. It covered things like disinfection at airports, the measures needed to be taken by the crew, measures that needed to be taken when carrying cargo. From the aircraft manufacturer standpoint, we focused in on the measures that needed to be taken to provide the cleanest environment possible, the disinfection methods that would be necessary to ensure that at least the touch points in an airplane wouldn't be a source of transmission of the disease for both the flying public as well as our crew members. We also focused on the issue of how can we optimize the environment within the airplanes, and we focused in on optimizing airflow across different aircraft types. Following this, several of our major manufacturers did a probabilistic analysis of the measures that were put in place coming out of CART phase one and the various layers of mitigation measures that could be put in place during the process of air travel. The probabilistic analysis that we did modeled airflow in the cabin and how the disease could be transmitted. And when we looked at all the measures that had been put in place, including the wearing of face masks, the optimization of airflow, disinfection, and other measures, we modeled that and came up with a probabilistic analysis that was later validated by the Harvard Public School of Medicine. And it showed that the cabin environment has less risk of transmission of COVID-19 than many public environments such as shopping centers and restaurants. Next slide, please. In phase 2, we turned our attention to updating the takeoff guidance, and also we turned our attention to the ways in which we could possibly open up international air transport. We knew that at that point in time, the measure taken by many states and within their sovereign rights was to put in place quarantines for international air travels upon arrival. Those 14-day quarantines had a profound effect on international air travel and basically brought it, as the previous speaker mentioned, almost down to zero. It put a barrier to business travel and certainly to discretionary or tourism type travel. So the CART and CAPSCA was tasked with developing guidance material on the use of testing as a means to alleviate the quarantines, meaning reduce or in some cases eliminate that, as a part of an overall risk framework or cross-border risk management measures. So the manual that has been referred to previously has been published and is available freely on the Icao website. Next slide, please. So let me talk more specifically about what the manual on testing and cross-border risk mitigation measures manual addresses. Principally, there are three major areas. It gives guidance for the potential use of COVID-19 tests as a part of an overall risk mitigation strategy. First off, to reduce the risk of transmission during actual travel. We have a responsibility to protect the traveling public, so we focused in initially on reducing the risk of transmitting the disease en route. Second was to reduce the potential introduction of disease from one country to another country, or what's commonly referred to as translocation of the disease. Ultimately, our goal in doing this was both to protect the safety of the traveling public, to reduce the risk of translocation, but also with a goal of using a scientific method based on the consensus of expert research that's been validated or peer-reviewed to eliminate or at least reduce the period of quarantines. In the guidance material, we look at a range of different strategies from the possibility of using pre-departure COVID-19 tests to post-arrival, or possibly even in combination. We have stuck to a performance-based approach, which I'll describe very briefly in the next slides. It is all built on a risk assessment framework. As a part of the risk assessment framework, we look at the prevalence of the disease. We give some target figures of prevalence in order to determine what sort of risks could be present in the state of departure as well as the state of arrival. We look at other factors such as the test positivity rate, the testing rate within states, and the healthcare capacity of the receiving states. And it provides a framework for states to assess relative risks between the state of departure and the state of arrival. Next slide, please. So some key technical points in terms of the process. It's a multi-step process. It's all part of a layered approach. First off, we have to ensure that all of the other mitigation measures have been put in place. There are tables which provide the relative effectiveness of different measures that could be taken in combination with testing. We provide a model on how to assess the point of departure risk versus the point of arrival risk based on factors such as prevalence and test positivity, and then a model on how to assess the relative risks, let's say from going from a low risk scenario to a high risk scenario, or an equal risk scenario to an equal risk scenario. The idea is to provide some basic guidance on what measures could be taken and how testing could figure into the overall scenario. Next slide, please. Some key technical points are raised concerning testing, and these are important. They introduce new terms into the aviation environment, things like test sensitivity, the likelihood that a test correctly identifies a person with the disease, test specificity, the likelihood that a person would be correctly identified without the disease, what we call positive and negative predictive value, which is how likely the test would predict a positive or negative outcome, which can be affected by prevalence, which is one of our risk factors. And this all figures into the risk framework. Next slide, please. So, next steps, as all the previous speakers outlined. We feel that it's extremely important to work with Icao and states on implementation of the manual. The manual will only be as good as it is implemented. It is optional. States still have a sovereign right to take the approach that they see fit, but we at least are providing some options for states to use testing, probably initially on public health corridors or a bilateral basis to alleviate quarantines. What Her Excellency, the Minister of Land, Infrastructure and Transport pointed out is cooperation and communications key for the future, and we will need to work together to implement the documents and to keep them up to date. These need to be living documents. As a previous speaker mentioned, my colleague from IATA, there is further work that's needed on how do we document in a standardized format the results of tests so that one state will recognize the measures taken by another state, and we build an environment of trust, which is so essential for building up a mutual recognition framework. And we'll also have to document the results of the vaccine. In the not too distant future, we also have to think about resilience in the future. Unfortunately, this has been a very bad pandemic. It certainly has not been the first, and it will not be the last. And in the future, we need to work together as a community to ensure that if another pandemic occurs, that it doesn't have quite as a profound effect as this one has had. It has been absolutely a wonderful experience working between government and industry, thanks to the leadership of our chair, Ambassador Asano. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mix. Very brilliant presentations, clear, up to the point. Now we are at the end of our presentation. Because of a time factor, we have a couple of questions, more than 10. We are going to share with the public to allow at least 2 from the press and 2 for the general public. If you allow me, let me read one question from the press, which read as follows. Can you further elaborate on how serious the economic risk is for airline and related industry in the coming months and years? I repeat it. Can you further elaborate on how serious the economic risk is for airline and related industries in the coming months and years? I would like to address this question to Mix, if we can give some few more clarification on that.
Well, I'll go from the manufacturer standpoint. We've experienced several months in which a couple of our major manufacturers have had no aircraft deliveries. That's absolutely unheard of, and we don't see that situation improving remarkably in the near future. 175,000 job cuts just in the aircraft manufacturing industry is evidence of the impact. But the manufacturers are sort of at the trailing edge of the impact. And I'd be interested to hear from Conrad, where the airlines are more at the leading edge of the impact.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next questions it come from the participant, and it says as follows: even if COVID-19 come to an end, the issue related to infection disease will likely continue to be addressed. What are the Icao future plans regarding the enactment of international standard and the revision of annexes? I would like to address these questions to the Director of Air Transport Bureau, Mr. Mohammed. Hello.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I was speaking to myself. I was on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's a very timely question. If you recall, even in the last council session, there was discussion on the need to look at the SARS. And from the point of view of Air Transport Bureau, you know that we have a new dedicated task force on health issues, outbreaks, that we have formulated last summer. And one of the main actions taken by Icao is to address the COVID-19 pandemic, both in the short and the long term, in order to assist the member states in enhancing their preparedness for any future pandemic, as Mitch has just mentioned. This task force has a mandate, and the mandate is really to review and update as required the existing health-related standards of Annex 9, the facilitation annex, as well as to recommend the adoption of any new SARBs as deemed necessary. So the work of this task force is continuing, and they will report to the next council session about the outcome of their work. The participation of this task force was open to the subject matter experts from all states, and also from the World Health Organizations and UNWTO and other relevant United Nations organizations, and also observers from the industry, mainly ECI, IATA, and Council. So this task force is looking really into the SARBs of Annex 9 and see the necessary updates that needs to be done. Also, there is work to be done for Annex 6 in order to facilitate the transportation of vaccine. So again, as the SARBs are there to serve the industry, and if there's any need to update these SARBs to make sure that it goes in line with the assistance that is given to state through these very difficult times. Icao was ready to work on that, of course. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Director. My last questions, it will be addressed to Clifford. According to IATA prediction, aviation demand will recover after 2024. Question: do you expect any change in the prediction based on the development of vaccination and treatment, or vaccine and treatment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a very good question. When we made the prediction to get international transport back to 2019 levels by 2024, it was actually on the assumption that there would be a vaccine widely available by the middle of 2021. So, in fact, it's hopefully it's happening a little bit faster than we originally forecast. But this was actually assumed in the original forecast that we made. So, effectively, we're still expecting international to recover by 2024 back to 2019 levels.
Thank you very much. I think because of time factor, we are going to certainly stop by questions from now. First of all, to wipe up, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Korea Civil Aviation Authority for the wonderful job done and for give us an opportunity as CAR members, industry, member state, and stakeholders to meet today and to be able to share experience which has been put together in a collaborative spirit in a very short period of time. And I think that it shows once again that the concept of innovation, not only in the industry, also in Icao, in the council, in sector, and private sector, is a reality. As we said, we are living exceptional moment which require exceptional way of dealing with issues. With these few remarks, I would like to thank everybody who has been able to facilitate this process, both from CAT, from member state, from the industry, and from all international organizations and all UN specialized agency of UN. Over to the chair and the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, our moderator, for moderating and organizing the session 1. Thank you very much. And also our speakers, thank you very much for your presentations and answers.